I'm so glad that you're able to join us today. So we also have a live stream going on where people that are not in the Zoom meeting can follow online. So I think that's what you heard just now. So my name is Teniola Tayo. I think some people here know me, some people might not know me, but then I'm going to do introductions very shortly. First of all, some housekeeping. You're in the webinar or in the masterclass webinar on how to write policy articles by Aloinett. I will explain what Aloinett is and who I am, and then introduce you to some of our people here in the meeting. This masterclass is expected to last for about 90 minutes or less, so it's going to be very tight. It's an initial one, it's a pilot, and we're going to be sharing some tips with you on how to write policy articles. So please, in order for us to have some, decorum in the meeting, please don't unmute yourself unless you've been asked to, or unless it's time to unmute yourself. In the meantime, you can introduce yourself if you'd like to in the chat. It's good for us to know each other. There's something that connects all of us, which is interest in policy writing. The other thing I'd like to excuse is if you hear any noise in my background, it's just people living their lives in the apartments or construction, so bear with me. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, to have you here with us. And I'd like to jump right into the presentation. Yes, of course, Sia, you can have the link. All right, so we're going to get started. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you can. Introduce yourself, tell us what you do, but then that's going to come up as well during the presentation. Again, please do not unmute yourself unless you have been asked to, just so that we do not have a noisy meeting and so everyone is able to follow the meeting properly. At any point during the meeting, you can ask questions. You can ask questions by typing in the chat and sometimes even by raising your hand. Some of our associates are in this meeting as well, so they'll be monitoring the chats. If you raise your hand, you may be called to ask a question. But again, we're trying to keep things very tight and very fast, so it'd be good for everyone to keep to the point, even when you're called upon to speak, whether to ask a question or to make a comment. We're going to start with the presentation in a few moments. And then, thank you for joining us. Let me share my screen. So it's presentation mode. Okay, there's a reason why we're all here, and it's about how to write policy articles. I think the inspiration for this session came to me based on some discussions or conversations I had with some people here and there. So I remember I was talking to an organization and they said, one of the challenges they have with hiring in the policy space is that people have very poor writing skills. And then I was called in to review a document by actually someone that's an expert in the field. And when I was reading that document, I was also somewhat appalled by the quality of writing. Writing is a very specific skill. Not everyone has the skill, but I believe very firmly that it's a skill that can be developed. So even if you don't know how to write or how to write well at the moment, you can improve your writing by following very specific steps. So in today's presentation, we're going to be following this outline, which is an introduction. I'm going to introduce myself, introduce Aloinett, and later introduce the topic. Again, apologies for any noise in my background. It's the reality of virtual meetings. And then we're going to be talking about the what, why, who, how, and where of policy writing. And then very critically, we're going to talk about influencing with policy writing, because I've been doing research on writing for a number of years now. And I've realized that there's that critical next step that a lot of us do not follow, which is how do you make your writing count? How do you make sure that what you're sending out into the world is actually bringing back the results that are intended? And then we're going to wrap up the session. So again, it's going to be very fast, very quick. But at any point, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or you can type the questions in the chat and you may be called on to answer the question, or you may be called on to answer the question, to ask the question, or I will simply, answer the question from what you've typed in the chat. So very quickly, introductions. I'm sorry if I get distracted. I mean, I'm a bit of an informal person. I have to admit, I take my work very seriously, but I don't take myself too seriously. So one of my life slogans is, try to enjoy, problem no dey finish. So even as we feel very concerned with Nigeria's policy problems and policy issues, we try our best to still live our lives and to still have good quality lives as much as we can. I'd like to talk a bit about my background. So my background is actually a picture from the Mombasa market in Kenya. I thought it was a lovely picture, and it was a spice market in Mombasa, but yeah, just some background there. So introduction, everyone calls me Tenny. My name is Tenny Olatayo. You may see some other Tenny Olatayos in the meeting, but there's only one. There's only one Tenny Olatayo, or Tenny Olatoluwani Tayo, Triple T, as some people call me. I run Aloinett. I am a policy advisor, so policy researcher, policy analyst, policy advisor. Been working in the Nigerian policy space for quite a while, and in the African policy space for going to about 4 to 5 years. When you're Nigerian and in Nigeria, you tend to be consumed by Nigeria's problems. But then when you step out of Nigeria, you realize that we face very similar problems in other parts of Africa. And then on the Africa level, working on trade, investment, and development issues. So I see myself as a thinker. I like to think about problems. I like to come up with solutions. I regard societal problems as Rubik's cubes, the way you have to twist and turn it here and there in order to come up with, the answer. So always thinking and grinding. But then when you think a lot, you can't just leave the thoughts in your head. The next step is putting the thoughts out there in the world as much as possible so that people can benefit from those ideas. And then increasingly, I'm moving from thinking to doing, which is something that I'd also touch on towards the end of this presentation. How when you think and then you put down your thoughts through your writing, how do you then do, right? Because we all have different skills and abilities that we can be leveraging better. So that's me. Aloinett is an advisory firm. I'm working on trade, investment, and development issues, but also increasingly looking towards capacity building, skills acquisition. We've done a couple of workshops. Some months ago, we did a workshop on social media for one of the agencies in Nigeria, the Bureau of Public Service Reforms. It was an in-person workshop in Abuja. And then I think last year, we facilitated a session with the GIZ on inequalities, so trade and inequalities in Africa. So we have some associates here in the room. There's Mohammed Badamosi, and then Aida Oluwagbemiga, if she has joined back in. Now, getting to the issue for today, or even first of all, setting some context. So, I mean, all of us here, clearly have an interest in policy writing, but then I'd like us to reflect on these questions even to start. And if you can share your answers in the chat, that would be brilliant as well. So who are you and what do you do? And when you describe yourself, I mean, who are you, which is your name? What do you do? Not necessarily what your job is, but what do you do? What do you dedicate your time to? What are you trying to solve, which is even the second question. What problem are you trying to solve in society? What is that thing that keeps you up at night? What is that thing that you keep on thinking about? Is it education policy? Is it healthcare? Is it sports? Is it entertainment? What problem are you trying to solve? And solving problems doesn't mean that you're an NGO person or a policy person. You can also be an entrepreneur that is trying to solve many different problems in our society. And then why do you think writing skills are useful to your work? I was quite amazed by the reception of this workshop, because I thought policy writing was a very niche thing where it was just a few people, that were interested, but apparently not. So policy writing is actually something that it seems a lot of people are quite interested in. And I love to see that. It just means that you have more people trying to influence the policy space, really trying to just push the needle when it comes to building the society that we want to live in. And then the other question here is what do you hope to achieve with your writing? Again, writing is not the end goal. So writing is very important. Putting the ideas out there is very important. But what do you hope to achieve with your writing in general? Yeah, I'd like us to reflect on that and perhaps put some stuff in the chat. Then the last question here is, what would it look like next year if you hit all your writing goals? So 24th of June, 2024, which is a nice date, I think, 24/06/2024. What would it look like if you hit all your writing goals by that time? Is there a number of articles you'd have liked to publish? Is there a particular status you'd like to have reached in terms of the recognition of your expertise? So let's reflect on that. And then if possible, put some of your ideas in the chat. Again, at any point, you can raise your hand to ask a question. I tend to speak very fast sometimes. So if I'm doing that, you can just, let me know that I should slow down, and I'll try to do that as much as possible. Now, the next slide is, so the picture on the right is a picture. I was looking for pictures of elevators, free pictures of elevators, but then all the pictures I was finding were I mean, they had foreign, they didn't look like they were related to our context. So I went to pick an old picture of myself from during the pandemic, when I was pretending to be, a babe. Somewhere in Senegal, I think, when I was working there. But then what I'd like us to think about now for 30 seconds is an elevator pitch, but then the policy edition of an elevator pitch. In Abuja, where I'm generally based, I'm part of the Abuja Literary Society, and we have our open mics at Transcorp Hilton, and it's free. So it means that anyone can go to Transcorp and join the open mic. And we know the kinds of people that are usually at Transcorp. So you have policymakers, you have government people, you have international people coming from all parts of the world. And then I'd like us to imagine, you get to Transcorp for an ALS event, and then you get on the elevator and you meet the policymaker that is key to solving the problem that you're passionate about. What would you tell the person in 30 seconds? So if you imagine, perhaps you work in the healthcare space, right? And then you get into the elevator and you meet the Minister of Health. And the minister asks you the minister looks at you and says, "Oh, are you not that person that is always talking about health this, health that, health this, health that in Nigeria? Oh yeah, now tell me what you want me to do about so and so problem. What are you going to say to them?" And this is very key because it's a question that I had to ask myself. It's very easy to write, it's very easy to criticize, but when it comes to really being very specific and concise about the solutions that you're putting forward, that's not as easy. Because of my writing, I wrote an article on kidnapping in Nigeria. I think it was 2 years ago. So I saw how kidnapping was getting worse in the country. And then I wrote an article saying, we need a holistic approach to solving kidnapping. Kidnapping in the North looks a bit different from kidnapping in the South, but it's one problem with different manifestations. So we need a national approach or national policy towards solving kidnapping. And then from the different things that I did after writing that article, for example, I engaged with my community, which was the Global Shapers. And then that led to the organizing of an event on kidnapping with some security officials and experts. And then after that event, we got the opportunity to meet with the Chief of Defense Staff. It was incredible. So because of someone from the hub, we're able to get a meeting with the CDS at the time. I think they just changed all of those officials. And it was a very formal meeting in his office with senior officials from the Navy, from the Army, from the Air Force. And then we were in front of them and they asked us, "Oh yeah, tell us what you think we should do about this problem." And then I realized that, man, it's not as easy as you would think sometimes in trying to be very specific about the solutions. And even some things that I told them, they were trying to explain to me, this is why this might not work. This is what we have tried before. And then just realizing that there's a lot more work to be done if you're actually trying to solve a problem versus just thinking about it and writing about it. So yes, please, let's have that reflection as well. Very quickly on to the next slide. In this session, we're going to look at the what, why, where, who, and how of writing policy articles, which I already said. So some things, the fundamentals of writing policy articles, how to draft engaging and persuasive articles, the techniques for conveying complex ideas, and then critically, again, how to position your articles for reach and influence towards the right audience. So what is a policy article? The topic for today. I think, first of all, I'd like to make some important distinctions, and I hope we're following, so far. I hope it's clear enough. Please, again, you can ask questions in the chat, and then we will try our best to respond to them. Now, there are many different kinds of articles. So a lot of people write, a lot of people do different kinds of writing, but I think a lot of people don't know the kind of writing that they're doing. So you have academic articles, you have academic research, but you also have academic articles, which are shorter than the research papers. You have analytical pieces, you have op-eds, you have journalistic pieces, and then you have personal blogs. I think the list is sort of in order of complexity and technicality. So academic pieces are usually quite complex and technical. Analytical pieces are also a bit technical, but less than academic pieces. Then you have op-eds that sometimes can be a bit analytical, but generally towards a more lay audience. Then you have journalistic articles that are usually, targeted at the people mostly, so not usually complex at all. And then you have personal blogs, which they are as relatable as possible. For example, I wrote a blog some years ago that went a little bit viral. So it was while I was doing my master's in London, and then I was just, shocked at not just the racism, but also the way Africa was portrayed and taught in my university. So I wrote a blog titled Africa as a World Problem Child and how I feel about it as an African. So that was a personal blog, right? Dealing with, a technical issue, which is the place Africa finds itself in the global economy. But then from a personal perspective, where I was using personal stories. So those ones are as relatable as possible. There are intersections between these different types, but it's important to know what you're going for. They have their different pros and cons, their different uses, but it's good to know where you situate yourself. Then I have this diagram on the right that will make a bit more sense because some articles are pointing upwards, some are pointing downwards. So those are the vertical ones. And then some are pointing horizontally, but you understand what I mean by that shortly. So again, with the distinctions, they're usually based on things like the style of writing, the level of technicality, the objectives, whether it's to inform or to educate or to influence, and then the target audience. So you can see with the diagram again, you have some facing up, some facing down. So facing up usually to policymakers and to decision makers. And the policymakers are not always the same as decision makers, right? So you have policymakers sometimes, even within the governments, that may make policy, but they may not be the ones to take the decisions because those are usually political people, so elected and appointed officials that have the power to do that. But also decision makers refers to other people like people that have the resources to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. So people that have money, whether it's entrepreneurs, whether it's billionaires, whether it's foundations, whether it's donors. So these are decision makers, people that have resources, not just financial resources, but political resources, social capital to really make decisions on the problem that you're trying to solve. And then for the ones facing down, they're facing more towards the general public, usually to inform, to educate, to create awareness, but also to mobilize support around an issue. Then you have the horizontal facing, which is usually, articles that are more targeted towards the a person's peers in an industry. So for example, if I were to write a horizontal facing article, it means that I'm trying to address my colleagues, which usually happens with academic writing. So academic writing is usually facing academic colleagues or other academics in a particular space, just to let them know the advances that are being made in a particular field or research. So again, the same diagram, and we've tried to place, the different kinds of writing on the diagram. Again, these things intersect all the time. So for example, with analytical writing, it's both facing up, but also facing horizontal, because sometimes analytical pieces can be directed at peers, just to also let them know what is happening. Academic writing is often, horizontal, but then sometimes facing down, sometimes facing up. I know they aspire to influence policy or to change people's minds, but they're not usually very successful. Then you have op-eds that's usually facing down, but sometimes op-eds can be read by policymakers because they're very relatable and accessible, and also they can be read by peers, so it's somewhere in the middle there. You have blogs, usually also facing down, but in many ways facing people's peers to different extents. So it's good to have this framework, and it's really about who your audience is. And this should influence and shape the writing and how you go about it. You have journalistic writing as well, which definitely is usually facing the general public. But in this case now, the general public includes everyone, as well as policymakers. There was a time so one of the things that happens when you write, and when you write in an accessible way, is that you get reached out to by reporters. So I can give some examples from my own writing. I wrote more like a blog on NSAS when it was getting heated. This was even before October 20. So I wrote the blog, published it with my school's blog at that time. And then the BBC reached out to me to do an interview on NSAS. So I got to do that BBC interview, trying to really share perspectives. I remember before the interview, I told them, can I carry like a placard in the interview? But they said, no, I can't carry a placard, because I was so activist at that time. I was like, yeah, I want to hold my placard even on the BBC to say, NSAS, and that what the government is doing is not right. But also, one time, I think some months ago, I walked into the office of someone with the police, I believe. Was it the police? No, I think it was one of the military officials, I think. So when I walked into his office with someone else for a meeting, he told me, oh, you look familiar. I think I know you. And I said, well, I mean, we haven't met before. And then he said, oh, I've seen you on TV. So he was referring to some interviews that I used to do at that time on TVC, on Arise News, on the security space, because I used to work in the security space on Boko Haram issues. So you see, from my writing, I was invited for an interview, maybe by TVC or Arise News. And then I did that interview that was related to my writing. And even though this person did not see the writing, he saw the interview, and that was one way to access him. So, having that background now, even walking to his office, meant that he was more willing to listen to what I had to say, because he already saw me as someone that was some sort of expert in a particular field. So, yes, general public, with journalistic pieces, they always serve the purpose of expanding the reach of writing. Now, what are policy articles? I think it's a bit of a tricky concept, right? And I think people confuse them a lot, but then they're usually short, between 800 to 1.5 words, ideally, because you need people to be able to read them very quickly. They shouldn't be as long as academic articles usually are. But you can have long form policy articles. It's just that the longer you make your piece, just know that the less likely people are going to read it. So the longer your piece is, the more likely that it's just people that are familiar with the topic that will read it. But when it's short, it's accessible, so you have a wider audience reach. So they are short articles to analyze a policy problem and take a position very critically, not just to criticize or comment, but to take a position based on available evidence. Now, based on available evidence is key, because that's one distinction between an op-ed and a policy article. So an op-ed starts with a position. Something happens, you don't like it, you want to talk about it. That's an op-ed, right? So usually, sometimes even from a personal perspective. But a policy article uses evidence to build an argument and then take a position on a particular policy problem, and then put forward recommendations based on the evidence and the arguments. They are usually very well researched and even referenced. So when you're writing policy articles, you can't just say things. You can't just, put what is in your mind out there. That when you do that, then that's an op-ed, right? Or maybe a blog. So if it's a policy article, it has to be well researched and it has to be referenced. When you put a figure, you show us where you got the figure from. When you make an assertion, you let us know why you made the assertion. So your evidence base for that. And then again, they always end with recommendations, almost always, because there's an objective with the policy article, it's to influence policy change. So there should always be the recommendations there. And then if you go back to the framework, so the style of writing, usually easy to understand. Easy to understand, easier than academic articles, but usually not as simple as journalistic pieces. But the aim is actually to make policy articles as easy to understand as possible, because let's not forget that in many spaces, the decision makers are not experts. So the policymakers may be experts, right? But then the decision makers are usually not experts in the field, whether it's a politician or whether it's the head of an agency or the head of an NGO, the head of a foundation. they're usually more generalist in their approach or in their understanding. So it's very important that your writing is easy to understand. The level of technicality is medium, so minimal background usually provided. In policy articles, you can't explain everything because you have very limited words. So it means that the people need to have at least some understanding of the issue even before they read it. The objectives are primarily to influence, of course, also to inform, educate, but the primary objective is to influence policy. And then the target audience, primarily, again, policymakers, decision makers, but also the general public, as much as possible. On to the next section, why write a policy article? These slides are very wordy, so if I can encourage you to take a screenshot and then go back to look at it later. The policy articles are very important tools in shaping understanding on issues. So there's this issue that's, very topical now in Nigeria, which is the oil subsidy or the fuel subsidy and everything that has to do with the removal, and also the exchange rates and everything that's going on with the policies that have been put in place regarding that. So sometimes you write policy articles to shape public understanding and help people understand complex issues, to break down matters into understandable narratives, very critically to influence public opinion. Because like I said, policy articles are upward facing, but also sometimes downward facing to the public. It allows experts to contribute to public discourse. Sometimes with policy writing, it's almost like a conversation or a debate that is happening within the space, how to move forward on an issue. And then they're used by decision makers and influencers as references to support their viewpoints. So you see many times with policy makers, when they're having their meetings, they say, oh, so and so wrote that, da, 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 and that's why I think that we need to do da, da, da. So they're often very useful as tools. But also very importantly, and I think why a lot of us are here, they help us to consolidate our knowledge on issues, to put our ideas out into the world. If your idea is in your head, it's not doing anything, right? It has to be out there in order for it to bear fruit. And then to demonstrate our expertise in a particular domain. So it helps us become thought leaders on a topic. I always make a joke about an article that I wrote, which in some ways is the downside of policy writing, right? So when you get very skilled at writing policy articles, you can write an article on anything in this world. So I was trying to write an article on foreign military in West Africa, but I wasn't finding enough research to really back the arguments that I was trying to make. And then someone told me, write an article on mercenaries. And then I told them, I don't know anything about mercenaries, so I can't write an article on mercenaries. But then when I struggled with the other one, I decided, okay, let me write an article on mercenaries. And then I did a deep dive on mercenaries in Africa. And then I wrote an article and then it got published. And that article got so much traction. It was republished by so many sites. So many people reached out to me for interviews. I think for my organization at the time, it was one of the most read articles. But then I am not an expert on mercenaries. That's the truth. So beyond the article and the content of the article, I didn't know much more about the topic. And that's one of the cons of policy writing, because when you're very skilled at it, you can, write things and then people actually see you as an expert, but you may not be an expert in that field. So it's very important to just write on what you're trying to build expertise on or what you're trying to be recognized for, which is what I do now. I stick to my domain, right, instead of writing random pieces. In fact, the article was so good, according to some people, that even experts in the field, I'll give an example. When somebody reached out to me for an interview, I referred the person to another expert, someone that I knew was very advanced in the field. And then I told the person, I wrote this article, but I'm not an expert. And then the person told me, even the expert told me that the article was brilliant. So even for an expert reading it, they also thought it was brilliant. And that's where you can get to when you know how to hack policy writing. But then, of course, try to stay in your lane as much as possible so you don't overpackage. Yeah. On to the next slide. Again, take a screenshot if you can. Again, you can ask questions at any point. So to raise awareness, I think I already mentioned this, to provide research and analysis on issues. So when people are crafting new policies, one of my key research areas now is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I've been using my writing and policy advice to accompany the process, right, to even influence the policy making It was because of people putting out articles and putting out ideas that, for example, the AFCFTA included a protocol on women and youth in trade. It wasn't part of the initial arrangement or agreement, but then they added it afterwards because people started saying and criticizing that, oh, we need this thing to be inclusive. We need women to be included. We need young people to be included. And then they actually changed the policy and included that. So it can help influence the crafting of new policies, can persuade policymakers to adopt new approaches or change existing ones, influence implementation of the policies. Then there's one I've highlighted here, which is to act as a bridge between academia and policy by translating academic findings into actionable recommendations. So policy writing in some way is like, the middle point between academic writing and then like the general audience, or the policymaking audience. As for academic writing, I won't even lie, my partner is an academic, and I always tease him that very few people are reading you guys' papers, and that's the truth, because even you guys yourselves hardly read your own papers. They're too long many times, and sometimes they're not accessible. So it's usually the job of the policy writer to, review these academic papers and then translate them into stuff that is relevant for the policymakers and the decision makers. And I'm not putting down academic writing. It's very, very important, at least to advance knowledge in the field. And then policy writing can mobilize public support for policy changes. So moving on quickly, the target audience. Let me have a look at the chats to see if we have questions. Again, if you have questions, yes, please leave them in the chats. And we'll thank you for that, Onye, and then we will try to address them. So the target audience really, and I like the image here. So you see a target literally, and then you see that there's the center, which is the yellow, then you see the red, then you see the blue and the black and the white. So you're trying to reach everyone, true, but then you need to have your core target audience, which is the yellow, and that informs the way you shape your article. Who are you talking to? Who do you want to inform or influence? Who cares about this topic? But also who can do something about it? They are two very separate things. The people that care about it may not be able to do anything about it. So who cares and who has power? Right. So you need to figure out who these people are and then make sure that they're included in your audience. So you identify your target audience and then you can build from there. So anybody else can read it if they like, but then you need to know who you're talking to. Now into the cocoa of the matter, how to write a policy article. First of all, a commercial break. If the session is giving you any value, you can give us some value by sharing on your platform. So you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. You can use a hashtag as well to just share, that you're here or whatever it is that you feel that you're learning. I hope you're learning. I hope you're learning something. So when you're presenting, you can't really see the audience, but then I hope that I'm being followed to an extent. Yeah, let's start with ideation, which is brainstorming. What do you want to say and why? Are you trying to address a current or perennial issue? Is it something that's happening today or something that's always been a problem? Do you understand the issue well enough to address it? And even if you don't, it's just something that you need to figure out and then start to fill the gaps in your knowledge. Why do you want to address this issue? Do you have some personal connection to it? Why are you passionate about it? What has been done about it in the past? What have others said about it? And what are your ideas? So these are some of the questions that you need to be asking yourself. I see it sort of like as a soup that you're cooking in your brain. When I'm about to write on something, I always I imagine it as cooking something in my head. So you be asking yourself questions, it will be swimming around until you form something that looks coherent, which we'll see on the next slide, which is doing a deep dive. And I have some really key tips here when it comes to doing a deep dive, because I think this is one of the reasons why people don't write articles. They feel like the learning that they have to do it is too immense. But it's because they limit themselves mostly to reading. All right. So when you're doing research or when you're trying to immerse yourself in a topic, you don't only have to read. Reading can be a very slow process. It's very important, to gather the academic papers, the policy papers, the research papers, but also the general articles on a topic, and to read them as much as you can. But there are other ways of immersing yourself. To read something, you have to sit down and read it and make notes and understand. But then you can listen. And I do this all the time. So I when I'm writing on a topic, I go on my podcast app and I just do a keyword search for the topic, gather the podcast on that. And it means I can be learning while doing other things. So when I'm cooking, when I'm doing laundry, when I'm walking around, I'm listening to different conversations and discussions on the topic, really understanding people's positions. And the thing about podcast, is that sometimes information is a bit more current than what you find in articles. It takes time for knowledge to get into published articles. But with podcasts, if you identify some of the key experts in that field, you can even just search their name on your podcast app, and then you see the interviews that they've given on the topic, and the information may be more up to date than what is available online in papers. So you can listen to podcasts. You can also watch. So go on YouTube, type the topic, and there you usually see recorded webinars where people have discussed this issue. It could be something very recent, something from long ago. And watching is also a nice thing to do. It's easier than reading sometimes, depending on the way you learn. But maybe you're having lunch, you can just put one of those YouTube videos, watch it, you're listening to the discussions. And the good thing about those debates and discussions is that you're hearing different perspectives. So when you read someone's paper, the risk is that you tend to just take that person's perspective and think that that's the dominant one. But then there are people that disagree with that person. So when you watch debates or listen to debates, you can hear the counter arguments to the particular perspective, and then it widens your own understanding of the issue. Then you discuss. So when you're working on something, talk to people, talk to experts, talk to even lay people, put it on your social media. When I'm doing a deep dive, I share on my social media that, I'm reading about this. Sometimes you see people comment, people that know more about the topic, people that can, support you. And then you think. I think that one goes without saying. I mean, for you to put an idea out there, it's because you're doing some thinking. So you're just, cooking everything, taking the different ingredients, it's forming a soup in your brain until you figure out exactly what you're trying to say about the issue. So yeah, you have the pieces and then you have to put them together, usually through an outline. I want to issue like a caveat here, research never ends, right? You need to start writing as soon as possible. And the first place to start is with an outline. Some people don't use an outline when they're writing, but it really helps. And I'd really encourage everyone to use an outline as much as possible. Because number one, you can start to write the outline even before you finish doing your research. And the outline helps you understand the gaps that you need to fill in your understanding. It helps you to start to consolidate what you're learning. And then it helps you to figure out the arguments that you're trying to make with your piece. And then even when you start writing, the outline can serve as a reference when you get stuck, which happens a lot of the time. So I'd say write that outline as soon as possible and then continue with the research, and then you start with the writing. So here's like a sample outline. There are many different ways of going about this, but then, there's a template that I can share with you, and then you can adapt to your own preferences. So you start with an introduction, usually with the context, the problem statements, and the solution. So just giving a brief of everything at the start. Then with your different paragraphs, explain the context, analyze a problem from different perspectives. Again, policy writing is critical and analytical. You're not just saying one thing and expecting everyone to accept it. You need to show that you're reflecting on different perspectives and positions. How did we get here? Then you present your solution. And before you present your solution, you need to set the stage. So you can't just come from the sky and say, this is what we need to do. No, you need to sort of like build towards what your solution is, so that the person that is reading it will not even tend to agree with you when they follow the narrative that you've created. So you show the rationale for your solution, you build your arguments, you criticize, and then you defend. And then finally you conclude with the recommendations and a call to action. So my first love, like I always say, was literary writing. I think the first thing I wrote when I was in junior secondary school, like everybody else, was a short story. It was actually a long story. But yeah, you can even bring some of your creativity here with the call to action so that it stays in people's minds. Some other tips for your outline: use a document editor that you can access from different devices, just so that you can jot your ideas anywhere. So if it's on Google Docs, even when you're in a taxi, when you're in a car, you can open it and add stuff to it. So you have like one central point for your ideas. You can modify your outline as needed. An outline is not a shackle, it's a tool, but it should show a clear narrative. So even for someone reading the outline, they should be able to understand what you're trying to say on that topic. And then it's also helpful to include word counts in your outline. So if you say introduction, 200 words, arguments, the 250 words, it helps because it keeps you from going over the word count when you're writing, which is something that happens a lot. So when people write something and they go over the word counts, they sometimes think that, that's a demonstration of how much they know about the topic, and they think it's a good thing, but it's not. And I'm talking as someone that had to learn this the hard way. If you cannot summarize and be concise about the issue, then you don't understand it properly. So true expertise it's the ability to be concise and to be able to, say what you're trying to say in as few words as possible. So it's about writing discipline, with the word counts. Then you write the drafts, and I'm going to start speeding through the slides. So yeah, writing can be very agonizing, and I'm the first person that'll tell you that I do a lot of writing, a lot of writing. Sometimes it feels like somebody's taking blood out of my body. I won't even lie. The way it can drain you. There's a quote I read somewhere that writing is like getting in front of a typewriter and bleeding. That applies more to literary writing, but it can be very agonizing, and writers are the biggest procrastinators. We usually sometimes need that adrenaline of a deadline to get something out. But yeah, just try to start. It gets easier after you start. So start as soon as possible. Research never ends. Start your piece, then try to follow your outline and get back to it when you're stuck. There's a quote here from Ernest Hemingway. I don't know if he's the one that said it, but people attribute it to him, where he said the first draft of anything is shit. So just put it out there, hey, I shouldn't have said shit, but put it out there, and put it down on your computer, on paper, and then you can now move from there. On to the next. Again, with your article, some things that you need to bear in mind. It has to be clear. If you cannot explain it to a 5-year-old, then you don't understand it. So first of all, try to understand it in a way that you can explain, right? So be concise, very, very, very important. Don't forget, policy writing has an objective to influence policy. And you won't be able to do that if you're not concise. Be persuasive, very, very important. And this is why you cannot just make a moral argument. So your arguments have to be based on evidence, and that's one way to persuade people. You have to do it in such a way that by the time the person reads everything, they're like, oh no, this makes a lot of sense, because they can follow your thought pattern, and they see why you approached at the conclusion that you got to. And then it has to be coherent, very important. The outline can help with that. It has to be impartial. I want to stress on this point. With many other kinds of writings like op-eds and blogs, you can bring your own position, your own perspective, or your own preferences into it. But with policy writing, you have to be impartial. So even if you have your own preference, I wrote a lot of articles on Nigerian politics around the elections. I had my own preferences, right? But then I had to be impartial in my analysis. In fact, there was one piece I wrote that I felt was very impartial, but by the time I submitted it, people were telling me that I was an obedient. I was like, but I was being very impartial even still. So I had to go back and, edit it again and try to be as neutral as possible in the analysis. So you can have your preferences. Sometimes they come through, but then you have to put that aside, and whatever you're saying has to be based on evidence. Then finally, it has to be actionable, but let your voice come through. That's one unique thing about everyone's writing. You have your own voice. Don't copy other people, and then you'll be splendid. So I like the quote at the side. You can always fix crap, but you can't fix a blank page. So you need to get writing. Time is flying fast, but then, how to start in the introduction. I think to explain the body of the writing or the approach to writing, we're going to actually look at an article that I wrote, and I'm going to share it with you. But then the introduction really just sets the context, your position, and the main points. Very, very short usually. And then how to conclude. One key thing is that you shouldn't introduce new ideas into your conclusion. Don't do that. You should always include a provocative call to action. Very important. You have to leverage the recency bias, because people remember the last thing that they read. So they may remember your conclusion even more than what you said in the piece. And then think about people that skim. Busy people are schemers. They'll look at the introduction, they'll skim, go to the conclusion. So it means that your conclusion has to be rich enough for them. There is some content here on the site. So, I mean, you can take a screenshot of this, but then I think this recording, actually, I changed my mind, it'll be on YouTube. So it'll be a resource that can be accessed. Now, yes, we're going to go into an example of an article I wrote in 2022 last year on the fuel subsidy, since it's very topical now. So I'll exit the Zoom. I hope this works well. I think I have to reshare. Reshare OneNote. And very quickly, what we're just going to do is to look at how is to just look at, the outline that I shared in terms of how you can go about things. We're going to look at how we can actually we're going to look at how it actually came to play in a life piece that was written by me, Microsoft OneNote. I think I'm getting old. Not as tech savvy as I used to be. Anyway, yeah, there it is. So this is an article on the fuel subsidy. And now there's a couple of things that we already said, right? In terms of the introduction, the body, the argument, and then the conclusion. So with this article, you have the first paragraph. The title of the article is Nigeria's petrol subsidy is a climate issue. Then you have the blurb, climate change financing could help solve the petrol subsidy problem while cushioning the blow for consumers. So it's sort of like a different, when I was writing it, I felt it was a unique take on the issue. It wasn't the first time someone was having that take, but it wasn't as prevalent as I felt it ought to be. So the first paragraph you see here is the entry. So Nigeria's government has said it would reevaluate its position on petrol subsidies this month. That was last year, June. And that's a sort of like explaining why I'm writing this article now, because the government has said this. So that is a policy window. And I guess maybe at later versions of this workshop where it's more advanced and it's longer, I would explain things about policy entrepreneurship and taking policy windows. When a problem becomes very popular, then you have an opportunity as a policy advisor to really comment and influence it. So then some background here about the all subsidy, but it's very minimal background. And then this next very short paragraph is about what removing the subsidies have done in the past. But you see, I haven't explained the subsidies properly yet. This whole section is still the introduction. The last paragraph of the introduction is, presenting the solution, right? Very concisely, very clearly, saying that this is what I'm putting forward. So that's your intro paragraph here. But then you now have to expand. So from your intro paragraph, you now have to expand on everything that you raised. First of all, expand on the context as much as or in as few words as you can. So here you now have the context of the fuel subsidy. So Nigeria is an oil exporter, but got trapped into subsidy payments, and also explaining the cost of the subsidy to the government. Talk about what has happened before. So different administrations have tried to end the subsidies. What happened when they did that? There was the Occupy Nigeria protest. And then now, even for more context, saying that petrol is not just about transport in Nigeria, but also about energy, right? Which is the key to the point I'm trying to make in this piece, really about the fuel as energy access in Nigeria, and the fact that removing the fuel subsidy can affect energy access, and you need a way to cushion that for citizens. So again, some arguments about the subsidy. I mean, people always say it for higher income Nigerians, but then I argue here that it also affects others, because you have micro businesses like, the barbering salons, the small shops that rely on usually a few generators for their business. The larger businesses use diesel generators usually, but then you have the more micro and small guys that use fuel. So it's going to affect them. Then you have some more, comments on the context, and then, still building the rationale, right, in terms of borrowing, and because borrowing had been the approach to try to resolve the challenges. But borrowing will not always be possible, because we're very quickly struggling with our debts. And then this is where I now present the solution. Right. So I added some more context. I explained again the problem. Then I came back to present the solution, which is that there's a need to tap into the current global prioritization of climate change and energy transition to mobilize revenues. So we need to cushion the effects of removing the subsidy, but the government is broke. So where do we get the money? And I'm saying these people now, these Westerners, they're just interested in climate change. So take money from them based on climate change. Even though you didn't remove the subsidy because of climate change, just go and meet them that, this fuel subsidy has removed it. It's going to reduce fuel consumption, remove carbon emission. So we need some money for adaptation and then use that to subsidize energy access for people. So I'm not going to go into the whole piece, but then you had that body, the argument, and then building the arguments very clearly, here. Again, look at this paragraph. This has been done before. It's very important to reflect on whether what you're saying has been done before and why it wasn't successful. If not, when somebody reads it, they just think, oh, we've tried this, it didn't work, been there, done that. But you need to check, has it been done? Why didn't it work? And why is yours different? And then, of course, building, and you have your summary here, or your concluding statement here. And then with the call to action here, which I had said at that time that austerity measures need to start at the top. So if you're going to remove subsidies, you also need to cut down government spending or the money that's allocated to the government. So that's just a live view of that piece. Now back to the presentation. Quickly running out of time. I think I underestimated how long this will take. Let me look at the chats. Okay, just some feedback. Again, if you have a question, type them down. So other tips for writing: give yourself a deadline. Like I said, writing will take as long as you give it. Figure out your ideal writing time and space. Do you like to write early in the morning? Do you like to write at night? Do you like music? Do you like quiet places? Do you like to go to a cafe? Do you like to be at home? Do you like to write in your office? Know what works for you, and then build on that. Then always be critical, with policy writing. And then remember how when we were young and we used to go for debates and we say, I hope I've been able to convince and not confuse you. That is policy writing, right? I hope I've been able to convince and not confuse you about what you're trying to say. Then you need to revise. After you push out the first drafts, next thing is to revise it yourself by reading it. After you revise it yourself, you need to also send to people, send to lay audiences, send to experts, even send to members of your target audience, policymakers, ask them, does this make sense? There's an article that I wrote very recently on how German businesses can take advantage of the AFCFTA. And then I sent it to someone, and then he asked me, who is the target audience for this? And then he was telling me that if it's for policymakers, it's great, but that if I'm trying to also reach the businesses, then I need to make it a little bit more accessible. So make it simpler for them to understand. So which was a good feedback from him. So keep to the word count, or try to keep to the word count as much as possible. Figure out your revision style as well. Do you like to print out the article and then, make comments on it directly? Don't get defensive when you receive comments. Don't ever do that. Just take them and then try to implement. So what comes after your drafts? What comes next? And I think it's a key thing where to publish. Again, pushing through very quickly. Choose a platform that reaches your audience, that reaches your target audience. I remember I was asked to write a blog for a place where I did a fellowship at the European University Institute. And then when I thought about the article that the arguments I was trying to make, I realized that their audience was not my audience. So then I turned that down. But you can have think tanks, academic blogs, journals, news sites that can publish for you. You can expand your reach by encouraging other platforms to republish. I do that all the time. And it's a hack that I think more people should do. So even when one person publishes your writing, you can send to other people and say, oh, do you want to republish this piece? Some of them would actually accept, and then you reach their audience as well. And if you're not getting traction in terms of getting people to accept your piece, start yourself. Substack, LinkedIn, Medium, you build like a portfolio there, and then you can move from there. So I think I have the last few slides. Dissemination is key to influencing, because this last section is on influencing, but then influence, yeah. Dissemination is key. Write it, but share it, right? On social media, within your network, in different formats. Now you have new media. You can go on TikTok. I don't have TikTok, but I think it would be great to share ideas on TikTok, on Instagram, do threads on policy, on your writing, put the main ideas. There's this research that actually said that for academic papers that were shared on Twitter with a summary, they were more read than others that were not shared on Twitter. So it's usually a great way to share, but also be strategic, because remember, again, you're not just trying to reach everybody. You're trying to reach policymakers. So where are these policymakers? Sometimes when I write something about a particular government agency, I write to my friends in the government and I say, can you share this within your government people? If it's on foreign policy, I say, can you share it with MFA people? Because I know they can reach them, even if I can't. So know the best way to reach your target audience. Then also talk to people, right? There was one time, based on the same article on kidnapping, I was at a cocktail by the Irish Embassy, I think, in Abuja, last year. And I spoke to some guys, and then I just mentioned that, I wrote this article on kidnapping, and they turned out to be people that were supporting the Nigerian police on kidnapping. So that led to a whole policy influencing process where they actually took my article, summarized the takeaways, and then used that to shape the support that they were trying to provide to the police. It's still ongoing, by the way. So talk to people, share in webinars, you're in a meeting on that subject matter, share the link and say, you wrote on this piece. Just, get it out there. Share with the media houses sometimes for interviews, because, these news interviews are more consumed. They're on YouTube, they're on TV, and more people can hear your ideas. Be strategic and proactive. Try to engage policymakers, decision makers, because now when you reach out to someone, you're not just reaching out to them from the sky. You can link your article and say, I wrote about this and this and this, and then they feel like you have something to say. And then you can now put yourself as a resource for addressing the issue, put yourself forward as that. Then my last slide, I believe is measuring success. So very, very key when you do all of these things. How do you measure success? So one thing I like to do, and I tell people to do, is to Google your name periodically and see what comes up, right? Now, the last time I Googled my name, I saw that Google now actually categorizes me as an author, which I didn't even do that myself. It was Google that decided that, I'm an author based on the things that I've published. See what comes up in terms of your writing, track down who is making reference to your writing. If you write a piece, one tip is to take the title of the piece, then use the columns, which is like a way of searching where you get the exact search terms. And then you see how many people have republished the piece. And then, ask yourself the question, have you seen your ideas in some policy decisions? That has happened to me many times, where I write something and then I'm in a webinar listening to policymakers and they're almost repeating my words verbatim. And, those are the little ways you can influence. You can measure your influence. And then, are you being invited to speak at related discussions? That's one way also to figure out if people are beginning to recognize your expertise on the issue. So if you're not getting enough traction, you need to keep writing, keep sharing. Rome was not built in a day. And then adjust your strategy based on data. So I think that's a wrong wrap-up slide. Then, thank you so much. Again, you can share on social media. I'm going to very quickly look at the questions now. We looked at the introduction, the what, why, who, how, where, and how to influence. Thank you for listening. I hope I didn't take too long. So I have some questions here. First of all, and if you have a question to ask, you can also raise your hand so that you can ask it directly. So when writing a policy article, what are the tips to ensure you're providing additional knowledge or position and not just replicating different material that you have consumed in one article? And that is why you need to immerse yourself in the topic. Again, if you limit yourself to only reading things, by the time you start reading a paper and you want to read it to the end, you will become the writer's best friend. I don't know how to explain it. You would start to you start to reproduce the writer's ideas, and that's what happens, because writers can be so convincing that by the time you read it, you go outside, you say something, you don't realize that you're just saying exactly what you read, and you're not really even saying your own ideas. So that's why you have to collect a wide variety of perspectives. You read different pieces. You can even use, I think there was actually a slide on that. You can use ChatGPT to argue from different sides. So you can use ChatGPT and say, oh, how do you argue for so and so? Then how do you argue against it? And you see some resources and ideas on like different sides to the topic. You listen to things, you watch things, you ask questions, and then that's how you know that you're being critical. So when someone even says something, you make sure that when someone says something, you have to, there's a training that I actually have on critical thinking. I think I'll do that at a later stage, But then anything you read, you need to like criticize it, be critical, ask where the person is coming from. If somebody is saying something about a policy, you need to figure out where is the person's position in that process. The person may be saying what they're saying because of their organization, because of their interest. So you need to understand why people are saying what they're saying. You don't just take things hook, line, and sinker. You take it with some salt and pepper, and then widen your perspectives. Looking for the other questions. The presentation, I'll have to think about it, but it's possible, yes. I think actually there's some other slides. Let me just go back to the presentation. Actually, there's no need to go back. So for everyone that is registered for this meeting, we'll send you an email where you can join like a policy writing community, and then some of these resources will be shared. And of course, we also provide the service of training people on policy writing, more advanced even sessions, whether it's for organizations or for individuals. I can see a comment from Sia Kumalo. He started writing by accident. That's very, very great to hear. I'm not seeing many questions. I don't know if I was very clear. That will be a first. That will be a first for me. Do we have more questions in the chat that I've missed? Ida? Okay, Anna?
Okay, quickly. So for me, it's about how to narrow your writing, right, to a specific area, where you want to concentrate on. Sometimes it can be pretty difficult because you see a lot of ideas out there. You just simply want to jump on it. And listening to you, well, quite an insightful class. But then in my head, I was just rambling because I've had this conflict for a while now, right? And then you touched on it a bit, and then I wanted to get more clarification. How do I narrow my writing or my area of specialty, in policy writing or in policy article to a specific subject area? Because my thinking is, if I choose a particular area, it might be limiting. What then will I be writing on? I feel like I get stuck in a place. So can you kind of provide, just kind of enlighten me on, how to focus on a particular area and still not run out of things to write on or talk about, or be caught in a space that you feel, you're stuck and you can get out of. Yes, that's me.
Thank you for that. It's actually a problem that I also faced, and it's what I referred to when I said I was writing on mercenaries and on things that did not really concern me. I think you have to ask yourself what you're really passionate about, right? So when they wake you up in the middle of the night, what's that one problem in your environment that you're very passionate about solving? And when you build expertise on that problem, it doesn't mean that you're limiting yourself, because that problem also exists within an ecosystem of problems. So if you're trying to address education policy, whether it's changing the curriculum, there's an ecosystem of problems around there, around skills, around capacity building, around, for example, the labor markets, because from education, you go to jobs. So you have the main area, but then even as you build expertise on that, you can also look at the ecosystem and things that, in some ways intersect with that main area. Again, things change. So for the next couple of years, you can decide to focus on one thing, and then maybe you try to move to something else. That's also very possible. But you have to ask yourself, what are you passionate about? What is that one thing out of everything that you're passionate about? What is that one thing that you want to be known in the next 10 years for as the go-to person on that problem? Policy influencing and thought leadership is a long game, and that's just a reality. So it's over time that you really build that expertise. So in the next 10 years, when they say Anna White is what, right? What is that thing that you want people to know you for? And then you need to try to, as much as possible, write within that space while still looking at the ecosystem. I don't know if I've been able to answer your question. I can see.
Yes,
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
But it's not easy. I mean, trust me, I was such a generalist myself, but then I just had to force myself to pick an area, because you can't be an expert on everything, and that's just a reality. I can see another question here. How do you avoid being over descriptive rather than analytical? It's a very key question, because when you're writing on technical issues, you often feel like you need to explain and explain and explain. So you're writing on the fuel subsidy, you feel like you need to explain everything. You're writing on the exchange rate, you feel like you need to give all the background. But you can't do that with policy writing. If you're writing maybe a policy brief, which is around 3,500 words to 5,000 words, maybe you can do that. But with policy articles that are 800 to 1.5, you can't explain everything. So you need to figure out what the key points are. Right. Think about it this way. You know how when we were babies, we used to see mothers, I don't know if people saw this show, but when I was a baby long ago, how they would chew like meat, and then maybe they were trying to feed the baby or the toddler. They would chew meat and then give the meat to the child. So it's what you kind of have to do as a policy writer. You need to chew the meat, you need to chew all the information, and then figure out the key parts of that information that are relevant to your audience, and then stick to that. You can't say everything. And the thing that we also do, which is with referencing, is that you say something, maybe there's a resource that explains more about it, and you just link it in the article. So the idea is that if someone wants to know more about that topic, they can follow the link and learn more about it, because you can't say everything and you can't be repeating what people have already said on the topic. So figure out what is key to the narrative that you're building and stick to that. It comes with practice. So you just have to keep on trying, and then getting feedback, and then moving from there. I think I also saw a question on how to not replicate what others have done. And it's very key with research and policy writing, finding a gap in the analysis that is out there. Again, it's about expanding your horizon as much as possible, in immersing yourself in the topic, figuring out the unique position that you have, or the unique perspective that you have on the issue, and then presenting that. But when you have a unique perspective, don't even just say, oh, I have an idea, and then you put it out there. First of all, Google your idea. So if your answer is that, oh, the sky should turn red, so that everybody can be happy, don't just put it in your article. First of all, Google, the sky should turn red so that people can be happy. And then you see how many people have maybe said that in the past, and see what the argument against that was. So it's always good, even when you have what you think is a unique position, to interrogate it by looking out there and seeing if other people have said the same thing. And then instead of repeating the same thing, you come with the more unique perspective. Another question here, will a policy paper to criticize or to confirm a policy take the same form? Must they both have recommendations, even if you agree entirely with the proposed policy? No, Jemima, they don't always, the policy articles don't always have to have recommendations. It depends on the objective, right? So like I said, policy articles can be upward facing. They're mostly upward facing, in which case they usually have recommendations for the policymakers and decision makers, but they can also be downward facing, and they can be horizontal, so facing peers. And when it's facing peers, it can be to establish agreements with the policy, especially when there's a lot of debate against the policy. You can put something out there and say, I agree with it, and this and this and this is why I agree with it. And And it can be downward facing to inform or to educate people, to break down a policy for a lay audience. A policy article can try to do that as well. So I think the difference between the two will be the way you build your narrative, right? With one that has recommendations, you're trying to convince people to take a particular action. But when you're confirming a policy position or when you're agreeing with it, then you're just defending that position, but also you're countering the arguments that have been made against that position. So that will be a key distinction between the two. So another question, Anoluapo is passionate about period poverty and menstrual hygiene, and there's more data from foreign sources and home-based. So is it okay to relate these foreign studies or keep diving for African Nigerian sources? Well, it depends. Usually, even when you have data on foreign databases, if the data is on Nigeria or West Africa or Africa, most of the time their original source was actually from a Nigerian source. So it's just that with the Nigerian sources, you may not find them very easily online, but these guys have done the work of going to collect the data from maybe the Ministry of Health or whichever ministry it is. So just check what the original source for the data is. Again, it's a very short seminar. So this ties back to research and how to interrogate research from different sources. It's not all the data that you see online that you can believe. Go back and check, where did they get their data? So when they put it, what are they citing as their source for the data? Does that source exist? And do you trust that source? So yeah, with foreign studies, they do have Nigerian data. The UN, for example, has access to the Nigerian agencies more than you might. So their data is actually from them, even if you're not sure. It's just to confirm. Another question from Sophia is, will a policy paper okay, I think it's the same question, yes. Yeah. I don't know if there are any other questions I've missed. Again, you can raise your hands if you have questions. Someone has asked, tips on finding a niche. I think it's what we addressed. Think about what you're passionate about. I think that's what I can say. Think about what you want to be known for, in the next 10 years. What is that one problem that when people face that problem somewhere in the world, anywhere in the world, they think, oh, the person to call is Mustafa, or the person to call is Sophia, or the person to call is Oluwadunsin. What is that one thing that you want to be known for, you want to be an expert in? Again, with the slides, we'll see if we can make it available, or we'll consider that and share with you. I think the question about being analytical versus descriptive. Okay, another question. What are the typical places where policy articles can be found, or how do I identify a good policy article? It's a good question. So you have the regular Google search that you can do, which is a starting point, but also you have other databases. So when you use databases like a Google Scholar, you get papers. If you're affiliated to any university, they usually have like an online library or web portal that you can also do keyword searches and you find papers. And what you do with those papers is that you use them as focal points. So when you find a very key paper in what you're trying to research, go to the reference list, and then you see even other interesting papers. But I must warn you that it becomes a never-ending spiral. So you go to the reference list, you see more papers, you get those ones, you go to the reference list again, you see more papers. So it doesn't end. But then you just need to get some key papers and they can signpost you to others that are very important in the space. So policy articles can also be found on the websites of NGOs, of think tanks. I used to work with the Institute for Security Studies, and they have a platform called ISS Today, where every day they're publishing a policy article on that platform. So it's, a good resource, as well. I still write for them. There are many think tanks that have platforms for publishing policy articles. You can also find them sometimes on news sites, very limited, but sometimes you find them there, usually under analysis, not under news or under opinion. So under analysis, but also be very careful about what you consume, be very careful about how you regurgitate what you're consuming. Be very careful that you're taking a position that you can actually defend. You can't say you're saying something because this person said it. Yeah, even if that person said it, you need to know what others have said against that person and know what your response is to the person. So it's almost like having a recurring debate in your mind, talking head saying, one point of view, another point of view, and then you now come to a position. I think the final comment I'd like to make, and I'm really glad that we did find a way to keep this within time, around 75 minutes, which was the initial target, is okay, maybe before I make the comments, Fatiha, do you want to say something?
Yes, I want to. Thank you very much for this insightful seminar. My question was with reference to your last statement with reference to references. So I was curious as to, since we don't have to be very analytical or academic, how do you reference those references? Because I'm always confused. Do I put the entire name, or do I just put like a quotation and say according to so and so? So with policy writing, how do you reference, the author properly? So that's my question. Thank you again.
You're welcome. And so there is one way to go about it. There are many different ways to go about it, and it depends on the platform that you're writing for. But one way to go about it is just to link the source, literally. So I'm trying to find, well, I can't find it, but let me go back to this OneNote where I already copied. Am I sharing the right thing? No, I don't think so. So usually, how do I describe this? You can write what you're saying, and then you just wait. So if you say, analysts have said that 90% of, or you can say that according to the NBS, 90% of Nigeria's exports are based on oil and gas. Then you just link that 90%. So you highlight the 90%, then you link it. So when someone clicks the 90%, it takes them to the site, in this case, which is Nigerian Stats, the site where that information has been shared. So it's the fastest way to reference things usually nowadays with policy writing, because your word count is very limited. So you need to make sure that you're not wasting any words as much as possible. I want to just even very quickly show an example of this, if I can locate it, because I think it's a key one, and I think some people actually struggle with it. 1 second. Okay, so I can't find it. Well, yeah, maybe I'll share these resources with everyone after the webinar, just how to go about some things when it comes to referencing pieces. Again, this is more like an introductory session on writing policy articles. There are more advanced conversations that we can have on this topic, but thank you for that question. I think we are, yeah, so the session was live streamed on YouTube. So after the live stream, we're going to make the recording available on YouTube. And I'd like to close the session now. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. It's been such a pleasure. I hope it was valuable. I hope it was valuable to you. And yeah, please stay in touch with us, stay in touch with our work, and do engage here and there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.